I had a couple of kind of big things happen this last week with the weaning of Apollo, and also I had this. Oh, look, I can share it to a group. This is great. Um, I also had a thing kind of happen with myself last week. There you go, perfect. Around some negative feedback, and I wrote about it to my community, and people found it very impactful. So I wanted to kind of share it here. I've been flirting with doing a bit of a series, just talking about sort of the transparency of what we go through, not just as entrepreneurs, but just in life, and the difficulties. I think there's things that happen behind the scenes that we don't always get to see glimpse of, and I like to kind of speak transparently about a lot of things. So this is one of them. So I let's talk about what I'm talking about. So last week I had, and I'm doing a live stream about it now because I had a very full week last week, and then I'm in training this week with my horse girls. But we were talking about this today, so I wanted to do a quick live stream about it. But I got some negative feedback last week from a woman that's in one of my coaching programs, and I shared about it because I think that a lot of the times I think our greatest fear is to get negative feedback. And I know that as a facilitator and working with other mentors myself, that negative feedback is actually something that happens a lot that we just don't talk about. And I think it's a really important thing to talk about. So I'm talking about it in my own experience of it. And it was impactful for the girls that I'm doing a training with, my equine training this week, and I found it. Hi, Wendy. Very impactful. So I wanted to speak about it because, again, it showed up again today when I was speaking with my girls that are in my training program. And part of my training program is we talk about, how do we facilitate and be with different things that come up for people. And, we don't always know how to be high, and we don't always know how to be with feedback that's uncomfortable, right? And I actually should have, I used the word negative feedback, but I think it's our judgment on feedback. Feedback can be uncomfortable, but anyways, it was impactful for my community and wanted to do a live stream about it and kind of dovetail it with the distress of this weekend, having to go through an uncomfortable energy with weaning Apollo, and how do we be with that? Because I think this is a challenge. So I share very transparently of the things that happen. This is through my lens. So again, I got some feedback last week from a lovely woman who's in one of my groups, and I had to navigate kind of through holding that. And again, I wanted to share how I was with it because I think it's important. We don't always know how to do about it. So I will share that one of my greatest fears as a facilitator is having feedback from somebody that says basically the space is not valuable, or I'm not, doing, I'm not being impactful, or, whatever that is. That's my greatest fear. My greatest fear that somebody's going to invest in me and it's going to be terrible. So I have that fear, and I had a manifestation of that where I got feedback from a woman in my communities that shared about some of her concerns or, disconnect in a space, and basically unhappy with how I was holding the space. And, it was, of course, hard to receive, but I think, again, why I'm sharing this, because I think that one of the things that I notice in my own experience with other mentors and stuff, that when we receive feedback that sometimes, again, can be a little bit painful to hear, our tendency is to kind of like get very defensive or shut down. I definitely have had moments of, of witnessing other people kick people out of Facebook groups, or just and just refuse to engage, basically. I think it's really, really important, even if the conversation is uncomfortable, to be with it and to bear witness to what the feedback is happening. And then I think be able to separate our personal experience of it. So I know that a part of being a facilitator, my own responsibility is to know how to work through my own stuff, and then be curious and available to have conversation with the people that I'm holding space for. And I've had to navigate through conversations like this in some of my programs, because it happens. I actually, in my training program, I have a wonderful woman there too who's had some conversations with me as well about being able to bring up the things that she was uncomfortable about. And I always tell my people, this is your container too, and I'm available for conversation. So I think that I think it's important for us to be available for things, and we're going to get triggered. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, there's a couple of different things here. I shared this with my girls today. I would be completely lying if I said that if somebody gives me negative feedback that I don't care. Of course I care. I had a moment last week where I received this feedback and I got very hurt. And I was hurt and I started to question myself. I started to think that, I have no business coaching. I'm worthless. There's no value in what I do. I should just quit. I shouldn't. What am I even doing? Why do I even do my work? And there was that whole thing that kind of came in there where I took it as a personal attack that I'm a horrible person, basically. Now, what I had to separate is to just acknowledge my hurt, but not bring it into the space of conversation with this woman. Because on the other side of it, I also wanted to be really honoring of her experience of it and look at, is there truth in what she's saying? And is there adjustment? And how can I really honor her perspective too, without taking it personally? So I feel like it's very important for us to be available with difficult conversation and not stay in that lens of taking it really personally. And I think I've had to learn, how to manage my own emotional response to something and not throw it and get defensive and make it about the other person. So, I think I don't always see this held very well. I think this is a very hard thing to be with. I've learned a lot around working with horses about how we be with feedback and take it in as information. And what I was sharing with the ladies today that I'm training is that my stake in my work when I'm holding space for people is I really want to honor everybody's process, and I want to be honoring as human beings, even in our mess and even in our hurt. And sometimes what happens is we hurt each other when we're going through a process. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to not be available to have that conversation. Or again, to sort of stay in that place of taking things personally, that I shut down or I deflect or I abandon or I dishonor, the person that I'm in conversation to. I also think as a facilitator, I have a responsibility to be present and available to listen to feedback, even if it's painful for me to hear, and to not stay in the pain. And so I talked about how I was able to navigate through that initial place of being really hurt and to question everything that I was doing. And maybe this means that I shouldn't, again, be coaching, and I'm not worthy of this. And then it dovetailed into all of my spaces are crap. And this is, I shouldn't be doing my work. And natural place to go. We all have our triggers and all have our wounds. Again, I got stepped on my greatest fear. And this is not the first time this happened. So, and again, I think it's important to speak about, because in the transparency and realness, I think everybody's going to come up against a place where we get feedback that's hard to be with, and that's life. That I was sharing, like, how do we be with that? How do we navigate through it? With what I witnessed with the herd this weekend, with Weaning Apollo and the distress and everything, and the message I got is, and I'll share another video of today because it's, again, a very different space. What's amazing to me with horses is how quickly and fluidly they move through different states of being, and going from distress, and we took Apollo out of the herd, from Apollo Mama to today he was lying down with the other horses, which is amazing. And we have the capacity to do the same thing if we sort of pay attention. And I think I wanted to share these pieces because my community, when I wrote about it, found it very impactful, and I thought this is a good thing to share. So I was hurt when I got this feedback. I was in distress. I took it personally. I questioned everything that I was doing, to the point where I was even having these thoughts of, I'm not capable of doing this. Everything I do is crap, and thinking about all of those things. And again, I had to separate my own process from then being available and present to this woman in my group and really hearing her out and listening to what she has to say and navigating through that conversation without pulling my own emotional turmoil into it. And I think that when you're in that position, you have to be conscious of that and responsible, for your own process and your own management of it, while being authentic. So I gave space to my hurt, and I gave space to that feeling of, you know, the authenticity of taking it very personally. And then the recognition that it doesn't mean that I'm terrible at what I do, because that's our saboteur at play. So what I see a lot sometimes with this whole feedback thing, and I've seen it in other mentors too that have had bad feedback and it just goes very terrible very quickly, is we have to be able to separate and kind of take a step back and be present and available to have these conversations that feel uncomfortable. I really do. I think there's so many times where we shut down, or we don't listen, we don't take responsibility, and then we just, you know, we block people and delete them and kick them out of spaces, which, you know, that's not, I don't think that's being in integrity at all. And again, it's we have to be available to be in this conversation sometimes. I think that's really, really important. So I separated, you know, my own stuff, and it did hurt me. And then I sort of got to the place of, I need to honor this woman who's in this container and really hear what she's saying and get curious about what she needs, because it's important to me, number one, to hear everything that people have to say. And when I'm co-creating a space, and I really think the spaces I co-create with my clients is co-creation, that they have full permission to speak when things aren't feeling the way that they would like it to. And they're allowed to ask ask for what they need. And I have to, taking the time to allow ourselves to process and engage versus react, totally, which is a big thing. And, you know, I think it's I think be available also to receive feedback, regardless of what position you're in, as if you're holding a space or if you're participating in it. So one of the things that I always say to people, my clients, is I am available for feedback and conversation, and that I empower people to really speak your truth, because there's so many times where we don't have that availability, or because somebody's guiding us, that we don't feel like we can speak back. And I think that that's toxic. You know, if I'm in the space of creating a container for somebody, it doesn't put me above them to the point that I know right and they don't ever get to have feedback with me, right? I have to be available for that, and to really listen to what's the truth and what they're saying. And so with this woman in conversation, you know, my curiosity was, what does she need? And what is the value of what she's bringing to the space? And how do I really honor her? And to separate, you know, if there's anything that's feeling like an attack on me, to separate that and deal with it and get back into navigating this conversation. And I did. And I think, again, it was looking at that lens of, I want my space to feel valuable and I can adjust, and I need to hear what this person is saying to me. And it really helps me be better as a facilitator and a coach or mentor or whatever. When I can be available, like, I think what I love so much about my work is I want my clients to stretch me. You know, I want them to grow me in my strength, and also to model something I think is very important, is this: when we're holding a container for somebody or some people, how do we go through these things? And also to I think some of the things that I see with my clients is we're so afraid sometimes to create our spaces because we are afraid of this very thing. And how am I going to be with it? And I think the reality is, I have gotten negative feedback over the years. I have. And I've had to learn how to be with that. And I think that what was really cool about what happened last week, that it ended in a very powerful conversation where I think this woman felt that I really saw her, and I listened to her, and I adjusted, and I honored her, and I didn't get defensive, and I didn't blow her off. And we had a really amazing group coaching call with the other ladies, and it was very powerful. And I think they all felt it was very empowering, and they saw a display of a different kind of leadership that I think is lacking sometimes, because and I've seen this too, I think when we're in that mentorship space, it's like we can't be vulnerable, or we can't admit our downfalls. And I said, listen, I'm human too. Sometimes I make mistakes. Sometimes, you know, I don't do things maybe the way that everybody loves, and that happens. And it doesn't mean that I can't adjust to that or stay in conversation, and something really amazing can't grow from that. So I think it was very impactful, both for me. I think it was impactful for the group that it was in, and we were very transparent about talking about it with the rest of the group. It wasn't something, there was some of it done behind the scenes and some of it was done in the open. And it was like, I didn't delete it, and I let it be there. And it was very humbling for me, and it was painful and it was vulnerable. But I think that what was more important to me is to be with the realness of it, of we can navigate this together and we can hear each other out, regardless of you're the client, I'm the mentor, and that means that I have some crazy power over you and you have to listen to what I say. And I can adjust and I can be available for that. I think it's, feedback is one of the things that I think is very dysfunctional in our world. We don't know how to be with it. We don't know how to receive it. We don't know how to navigate through it. And I think that it can really shut down, and we use it as a way to actually exit out of conversation and growth because we can't be with the discomfort of it, or we buy into that story, that we go into that personal hurt about it, that this is what this is. So again, I got hurt and I acknowledged the hurt. And then I moved through it and I said, I realize that this is my saboteur, false self, whatever some of the jargon call it in coaching. And then I reminded myself, what is this about? This is about really listening to this woman who's paid to be in my container. And I want her to have a valuable experience. And I want to be able to be available to how I can meet her and her expectation. And how do we move forward from this in a way that we're on the same page? And the other thing was, I think there was a place of, I feel very honored that these people can feel like they trust me enough to speak things that feel very vulnerable on their end. How difficult and courageous is it to speak and give feedback where we know it may cause waves and it'll be hurtful, but we're doing it in service of something. So, the thing I said to this woman is, I'm so honored and good for her to speaking her truth, and that she felt safe to be able to speak her truth with me. I think that was sort of the thing of a takeaway of, I've created that environment that somebody feels safe enough to speak vulnerably about what they're feeling. It's not a disrespect to me. It's not a disrespect to me. I think it actually was a huge respect and honoring to the container and speaking to something that was in the space and honoring a very authentic feeling that she was feeling, and valid, totally valid. I remember one of my training, same thing happened, I think, with my equine training program that I did. There was a woman in the group that she got triggered by something that I did that was an unintentional impact, but there was a tension in there, and everybody was watching it. And I think the girls, from a learning how to facilitate standpoint, also found it so powerful. And they're like, well, how did you stay in that conversation and not get defensive and not tell her she was wrong? And I said, because she's valid to feel what she feels. It's not about whether she's right or wrong. It's about that she's valid to hear what she feels, and I need to hear that. And that's important, to be curious. And again, that was a tense conversation that I think people on the outside watching were kind of uncomfortable with. But we moved through it, and there was a really beautiful thing that came from it. I think it fostered a deeper trust. It was a great learning tool for everybody, because the truth is, reality is we're going to have conversations sometimes in all walks of life that are going to be uncomfortable, that someone's going to get triggered. There's going to be a concern. It's going to feel a little bit negative. We're going to mess up, and we have to know how to be with it, and to be with it not in the way of shutting down, to be reactive, to get defensive, to make it about us being heard or somebody personally attacking us, because that's not the intention of it. And I think it's an opportunity, again, to grow, to be heard, to be witnessed, to be validated in what we're feeling. And everybody's allowed to feel what they feel. Yeah. And here's the thing. It's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable. I think going on when I shared about the weaning that happened today at the field, I was very uncomfortable with the distress that was happening at my farm with weaning my horse. The mama was in distress. Apollo was in distress. It was grossly uncomfortable. And in some ways it was excruciatingly painful. I cried because I could feel it, and it was really hard to be with. But you know what? If I didn't allow that to happen, or I tried to bypass it or not do it, you would have missed, the growth of it. And the discomfort is part of the process. And there was also a point where this woman had said to me, I'm sorry about hijacking your time with this negative feedback. And I said, listen, it's not negative. That's a judgment. It's feedback. And it's important feedback. And it's very rich. And there's a lot of growth here. And is it comfortable to be in? No. Is it hurtful? Yeah. But, we can be with the hurt and move through it. And I think a lot of the times what happens when we get that initial sting of hurt, we react or we deflect, or we go into our story, and that's the end of it. That's the shutdown. We don't move forward from that. And I think that, I've learned that it's so important for us to stay with the conversation and get curious of how can I honor what's happening right now, and to see somebody and to not just have this through a lens of this person hurting me, because that's not what it's about. Are we going to get hurt? Yeah. And I think we also have to learn how to process our hurt without making it about somebody else and projecting it onto them. So I think it's, I'm sharing this because it's like, it's not really something we're taught a lot. And I think that I've learned a lot about how to be with feedback from my horses, of, to look at it as information, to be neutral, and to also, from a perspective of a facilitator, to be available, that we're growing too all the time. My clients make me better. They grow me, they challenge me. They help me, pull me into being more deeply present when there's things going on in my life. So if I just rejected that feedback and said, you're wrong, or went into that tailspin of like, oh my God, this means, because this is the other thing I see. When we receive something like that, or when we're fearful of this so much, we use that as almost a weapon against ourselves to not show up. I think one of the most vulnerable things to do, in my experience, is to be a facilitator or guide or mentor or coach, whatever you want to call it, for another, because we're constantly putting our neck out, and it's very vulnerable. And especially if there's an exchange, if someone's paying for our services and there's value. Like, I know for me, I take that very seriously. And I have a huge fear and vulnerability of what if it's not? And what do I do then? And I've seen in my other clients, and I've seen sometimes what happens when there is that exchange of negativity, or our just thought of that might be there, then we shut down and we don't do our work. Yeah, we don't. We have no idea how to, you're right. We have no training how to honor our feelings or process them, 100%. How come I can't see them? Yeah, we're totally dysfunctional on this. Absolutely. Totally dysfunctional, which is why I wanted a little bit of a live stream on it, because it's, just being with feedback and the layers of it, there's so much there. But yeah, we're absolutely dysfunctional about it in our society. I think that the wounding of this that shows up sometimes is, number one, as somebody who holds space in the world or shares the gifts, what happens when something like this happens is we can use that as proof to show ourselves that we have no business doing our work. And then we use that as that, weapon, I'm using strong language, to then not do what we're here to do. And we don't do it, and we don't put ourselves out there, and we don't create our offerings, and we don't create our spaces, and we don't lead, and we don't guide because we're so afraid. And I think that's tragic. I think that that's worse than, maybe having an exposure or vulnerability where we get negative feedback, is to not do our work at all. I think that's one of the greatest tragedies in the world, is when we don't. Or we have something that happens and that shuts us down so much that we never do anything again. And another story I have about negative feedback, I did a group session years ago. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago, and it was 5 people. And I remember there was a horse that was a little bit assertive with the group, and it was uncomfortable. And sometimes, I think that there's this idea, even with horses, that it's very therapeutic and healing. And that can happen. And sometimes, horses don't have that ego of, caring about what we think. So sometimes the mirroring with horses it doesn't feel very healing, or it's like really humbling. Like, here's what you kind of need to see. And it's not always like the most nurturing experience. I have different horses in my herd with different medicines of how they teach, and some of them are a little bit more assertive, and it's sort of like, getting whacked in the head by 2x4. And I had an experience with this group where I had this horse who was sort of like a little bit assertive with his teaching. Anyways, this woman had an engagement with this horse that was a little intense. And then, I was checking in with the group. How's everybody doing? Nobody said anything. Months went by. I asked for testimonials, and this woman wrote me, and she said, I can't give you a testimonial because actually that was a horrible experience. And I had no idea, and I shared with her, and I said, well, please talk to me about how it was and what happened. And she says, well, I had this idea that it was going to be this loving thing, and then she had this, kind of intense experience with this horse. And I said, sometimes with the horses, it's not always, coddling in these beautiful moments. Sometimes it's like we're getting mirror to an energy we really need to see in ourselves. And sometimes it's a little bit, it's a little bit intense. I've seen that happen all the time with, different things and different horses who have different styles of teaching, and that's the medicine you need. And, I spoke to her about that, and I said, I apologize for that, and I'm happy to offer you a complimentary experience and kind of, give you something. And she was really happy with that. Her husband then wrote me a pretty scathing message, basically telling me I have no business working with horses, and I shouldn't be facilitating anybody, and just like ripped me a new one. And this came, I will tell you, before. Yeah, totally. Animals are very authentic and transparent, and they don't really give a shit whether it's going to be offensive to us or not, because they don't have that thing, right? But this happened to me before I leased my first facility. So I'm getting this feedback maybe a couple weeks before I'm stepping into running my first facility for the first time. And man, that was a blow. And I sort of had a moment like, holy shit, here I am about to start like really going into this work, and I'm getting this really horrible feedback and somebody telling me like I really shouldn't even be doing this. And that's going to happen. And I had to sort of look at that and kind of use my discernment of where it was coming from and know, you know what, that's going to happen sometimes. And that's not a reason for me to not do my work. It's not a reason for me to not do my work. Negative feedback or any feedback that feels challenging is not an excuse for us to then go in our shells and decide we can't do what we're here to do. So I think that, I had that moment. I had a moment of that where it was like, I'm never going to do a group coaching program again because this is way too hard to be with. That entered into my mind. I'm not going to do this anymore. No, but I'm speaking to it because I had that experience too. But it was so cool. I had a coaching call with this group 3 days later, and we all showed up on the call, including the woman that had the feedback for me. And it was like the best call we've ever had in the group. And I'm like, oh my God, I love my work. So I think that if we can stay in the conversation and be curious and allow ourselves to process what we feel and not take feedback so personally, which is, by the way, it's hard to do. Like I can sit here and be like, I don't take things personally, and that would be a lie, Yeah. Why can't I see your comments? Okay. Yeah, totally. I agree, Francisco. I think I'm saying your name right. I do think that the universe is testing our resolve sometimes. Absolutely. And, I think what's important in that, I think it's important for us to also tend to the parts of us that are feeling hurt. So there was a way of like acknowledging for myself that I feel hurt and giving space to that and not bypassing it or ignoring it or feeling like I have to just get over it. So I think that that's a natural and authentic response as a human being. And I had to tend to that, but also tend to that not in projection with this woman in the space either, right? I can't make it her issue to tend to my hurt because that's not her job. But I had to give space to that too. So it was like I kind of created a container of acknowledgement of I feel really hurt right now because I'm a human, and of course I'm going to feel hurt. And this is pushing up against my edges that I have that are why I'm so terrified sometimes of putting myself out there and facilitating other people, because I'm so afraid that it's not going to be valuable for them. That's my worst fear. So I had to tend to that, Yeah, so I'm not bypassing that I'm feeling uncomfortable, and I'm not bypassing that I'm hurt, and I'm not bypassing that, I'm having this very authentic experience of really questioning everything. But I also use that as an invitation of what's my practice here also in my leadership. So that was another thing that really helped is what do I want to model and display here in leadership that I think is really important for these women to witness as well, that I feel that we don't have in the world. And, I think that was the thing of I've seen women in position, not just women, I've seen people in positions of let's say power, where they're creating a space where they've gotten feedback that hasn't been kind, and their response to it is to not listen to the feedback, is to kick people out, to block them or whatever, and totally dishonor the exchange. And I think that's toxic. That is toxic. I think we have to be available for feedback. Now, it doesn't mean like we have to take it on, or we have to, we can still be discerning. This woman was incredibly respectful and speaking her truth. And so there's a way that I can engage with that. But I think a lot of the times when we take it personally, we just, we just shut all the lines down of communication, and that's dysfunctional, And then I think it becomes this sort of this dysfunctional power play too, of you're in my space, I dictate how this is going to go, you don't have a voice. Any container I create, whether it's coaching or my training program, I always say to people, this is your container. You are part of the co-creation of it. You have a voice. If there's something that doesn't feel good, if it's not feeling valuable, if you're not getting what you thought you signed up for, we have a conversation about that and we talk about it and there's an adjustment. It's not that you just have to go along with what I say. So I think there's also of like, what does it mean to be a space holder? And what is that leadership about? And how do we empower other people? And then stay in the conversation and also speak to this so that when they go out and do their thing, because I teach people to be facilitators with horses, it's like you have to have this muscle. And then not feel afraid to put yourself out there and to be vulnerable and be able to be with feedback, even if it's hard. Because ultimately, we can't just not lead our spaces because we're afraid or we can't be with things. I think that's dysfunctional too. So there's so many, I think, layers to this. And the reason why I felt important to speak to it a little bit is because I don't think it's spoken to enough, and it happens all the time. And it's okay if it happens, and there's no shame, with it. I'm not a terrible facilitator, and I'm not shitty at my job because I got some uncomfortable feedback in my container. Thank you for giving me this feedback because it grows me in my leadership and it helps me tend to what's important to my people. And it fosters a really rich conversation of growth that we can now talk about where that applies to what we're going to do. And this woman who was in the conversation with me, she wants to lead spaces for other people too. So now she can kind of have an experience of how do we be in those conversations that are challenging, and not have that be a shutdown place. And it's a positive experience that, had a little bit of tension and mess, but it was very empowering as a whole. So I think if we can meet it that way, there's so much opportunity there, And I really have to give a lot of credit. My horses have taught me so much about this, because the beauty of animals and stuff is they're so neutral. And they give, by the way, horses and animals give each other feedback all day long. My horses have words with each other. They get into conversations, right? Like my two lead horses, a pony and Chief, they have a couple of conversations that get a little volatile. That happens, and then they have the conversation and they move on and they go back to grazing and they get over it, right? So it's, I think, like the agility we have to learn of processing and being authentic to what we're feeling, but then move through it and keep coming back to presence. And again, I think it really helps to have that thing of what's important to me and how I honor people, how I honor conversation. And I was sharing with my gals today, it's important for me to honor everybody with kindness and compassion, regardless of what energy they're bringing to me, and to be curious about if they're feeling hurt, what is that hurt, and not take it through that personal lens of attack, and I think to be curious about what's behind that, and how do I see this as a growth for me and step into the space that I'm being asked to step into. Yeah, totally. It shows us where we are and where others are. Yeah, they just don't have ego, which they say totally. And we have ego. And part of the beauty of being human is we get to navigate around having an ego. And I think that's another thing. It's like full permission to have moments where you're in your ego, because we're human, and that's part of the jam of being human. And we don't have to judge that either. That's allowed, right? It's like, I think that there's a place sometimes where, I wish for sure that people could have feedback with me. Is communication always better than no communication? That's a great question. I think that, I don't think I don't think that there's like a black and white answer to that, but I tend to think that communication is better than no communication, because I think sometimes in the no communication, that's when a lot of assumptions happen and a lot of stories happen. And then it kind of actually, I think, exasperates what's happening, when we're in our story or in our assumption about it. At least when you can talk about it, even if it's uncomfortable and you can communicate, you can kind of flush that out. And I also think where it's better to not communicate is when you're feeling reactive. So I've learned for myself, because I used to, we all have those moments where I've been reactive, that when I'm in a certain space, what I need is to have time to figure out what's going on for me and what's important before I communicate. Because if I communicate through a very reactive place, I'm probably going to cause a little bit of a mess. Now, I think it's okay to, if you know how to clean up your mess, that's fine. But I think that there is sort of an exercise of discernment that we can also practice when we're feeling very reactive. Because I know when I'm in reactivity, there's not going to be an availability all the time to get to the heart of the issue, and I'm probably going to come out with barbs, and it's going to be a little bit more to clean up. Yeah. So I've learned to give myself that space to recognize when I'm being reactive, and usually when that's happening, some of the questions I ask myself is, what's really important here that I need to speak to, and sometimes I need a second to figure that out. So I do this in personal relationships as well as with clients, because there's definitely times where I've gotten triggered by clients, and it's very, very, and especially I think we have this thing right now where we feel like we have to give instant feedback, oh my God, I got to get back to this person right away. We're getting messages all the time. So I've really practiced, if I get an email, to just and I'm being reactive, just to walk away for a second and really be with it, so that I can come back with some sense of a grounded perspective of how I'm meeting it, and I'm not exploding everywhere, right? So the pause is important, but communication is very important. I would rather, I think, you're welcome, Melanie. One of my clients in my training program, one of the things I've navigated with her, because we had a thing where she sat on something for a couple weeks, and then it came out, and I had no idea. And it boiled and boiled, and then it was bigger. So it was if we check things out also while it's happening, then it's not growing, because we're going to feed the story of it. It's going to become much larger. But I think the pause is important. Discernment and pause. What's really triggering for me? And then also in some parts that allows us to also take responsibility for where we're feeling triggered, right? So if I'm getting reactive about something, it's my trigger. There might be a communication that's really important for me to communicate with somebody. And there's also going to be stuff that I need to be responsible of that's mine to move through. And I don't want to make it that person's problem, because it's not. And it's not, problem's probably not the right word, but it's not theirs it's mine to be with. So this is I learned in my leadership program, responsibility for impact. So I tend to be more on the give myself a second to figure it out. What's important for me to communicate around here that needs to happen in the space, and what's mine to work through to take ownership of. And sometimes we don't know that in the heat of the moment, right? I'm an introvert. Introvert tends to be internal processors, so I need to honor my process of taking a second to figure that out. And then doing that is going to make the conversation and communication go a little bit less ornery than if I'm just in reactivity. And I've had to learn that in I remember even in my own space having staff, I used to be way more intense about things, because something would happen and I would get very reactive, and I would have the conversation with my staff, and it probably went a little bit intensely. Now I really sit with things a lot more before I respond. But then we can go the other way, where it's we're so afraid to respond that we don't say anything at all, and that's also not great. So yeah, anyways. So that's my share. But I think it's real. It happens. It doesn't mean that we're shitty at what we do. I think it's a really great opportunity to grow and to get curious, and to also be aware of where things are maybe a little bit vulnerable and tender for us still. So, obviously for me, going right into that place of questioning, why am I doing my stuff, is there's still a little bit of a fear that is maybe bigger than I thought it was. So that's an invitation for me to kind of look at that. And, lots of opportunity for clarity and growth. And again, I think it's so important when we're in any kind of space of authority, coaching, mentoring, whatever, that we're available for conversation for the people we're holding, right? And that we don't sort of take it as a reason why we can't do what we do, or that we become unavailable to people, because that's not really what that space is about. And that's my perspective of it. And the other thing I think too, it's we can navigate through discomfort, and it doesn't stay uncomfortable. I think sometimes again, kind of thinking about this weekend and the weaning and everything and the energy of that is it didn't stay uncomfortable. You know, it was really uncomfortable for a day, and it was really hard to be with for a day, and it was distressing, but that's all part of the process, you know, but it needed to happen, and now like the space is totally calm, right? So we get, I think, so afraid of being in the discomfort of something that we avoid it or we contract against it. We can be with discomfort, it's not going to kill us. And the other side of that, there's some amazing gifts, and I think it creates deeper respect and connection in so many different ways if we can just stay in the conversation and get curious. On the side note of that, you know, I think where negative feedback, we can create boundaries, because I had somebody ask me this: if you have like a hater, if it's somebody that's just being mean to be mean and it's not constructive and there's no, then yeah, don't engage in that, right? You know, that's a non-engagement. But I think that there's times where we disengage because we're uncomfortable, when really there's a powerful invitation to engage. And, you know, again, I speak to this because I think that there's this idea that maybe you get to a certain point in your practice where, or there's maybe this illusion that I'm never going to get negative feedback, and that just is not true. You know, that's not true. And I don't think it's talked about enough. And it doesn't mean you're terrible at what you do. And I think it doesn't mean that another person's a hater. It just means that that happens sometimes, and we can be with it, you know, and it doesn't have to, and it happens, you know. I think that sometimes we feel like if it's happening, we assume it doesn't happen to other people, and we make up stuff about that. So that's also why I shared it, because it happens to everybody. I've been mentoring and coaching and facilitating for 9 years, and stuff happens sometimes, and it's probably going to happen for as long as I do this work, and that's part of it. And really great, because then I'm growing too. So that's a little thing about that. So there you go. So I'm glad there was lots of good feedback on this one, and maybe it helped some area. And it's part of being human, and it's okay. Hold on, what's this? Big difference between mean and disrespectful. Totally, Tony. There's a huge difference between mean and respectful disagreement. Absolutely. And you know, I think, like, you know, we know the difference between that, right? We know the difference between that. So it doesn't mean we make ourselves doormats either, right? Like, we can still hold our boundaries and be in respectful conversation and still hear the other person out, and to not go immediately into we're being attacked, right? And that's the other thing too. It's like, I think we take a lot of times when we're sensitive to, I'm a very sensitive person, you know, it wasn't that that person was attacking me at all. It was them speaking a truth that I needed to witness and be available for. And it created amazing content and really incredible call with the group. So I'm glad it happened. And there's a gift, I think, in being able to model something of, again, how we be with something, and what tremendous courage it takes to speak our truth, even though it creates a discomfort. And I think that's another thing too. It's to not be afraid to speak something, even if it might cause a wave, because the wave might be exactly what needs to happen, and something really great can come from that. Yeah. Oh, how would you handle when someone is completely disrespectful in a business setting, but then acts as if nothing happened personally? Well, you know, here's my perspective of that, Alicia. So how do I handle, then I gotta run. So I got dinner. How do you handle when someone is completely disrespectful in business setting, but then acts as if nothing happened personally? You know, that's an interesting one. Again, I don't think that's black and white either. I think in some degree, there's a personal reaction in places because we're a person. But here's an example of, like, I'm a boss. I run a business and I have staff. And there's been things that I've had to implement from a business perspective, from opening, like holding a bigger space, that I've had people feel was disrespectful, or they didn't like the way that I did it. And in that case, I've had to, and I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but I'm talking about from the lens of my experience of it. where I've had to do it from that perspective because I'm holding a bigger business. So it isn't personal. It's like there's a larger space that's being held here that I have to step into because that's in service of the greater whole. And as a person who owns her own business and is a leader for that, sometimes I have to do that. Now, I try to be really respectful in how I'm holding things. But there is sometimes that separation of I have to do things from that lens and not personally. So I think it's a little bit, so my thing would be, I don't know the situation, but if someone's being completely disrespectful in a business setting, well, first of all, I would speak to it and share what's feeling disrespectful and have the conversation. This was a personal attack, not a clear boundary. Well, then I would speak to it, honestly, and just speak to it. This was the impact of that. Sometimes languaging unintended impact, maybe the person didn't mean to personally attack, and unintended impact is you felt attacked, and there was maybe a disconnect for them, right? Listen, I think that sometimes when I'm sort of in my own thing, that there's people feel maybe there's a disconnect. So I would speak to that. Yeah, just articulate, communicate. Listen, this was really hurtful, and I want to check that out with you. It might not have been the intention, but this is how it landed, right? Because sometimes we don't know how our stuff lands. So that's how I would hold that. But that's that. I don't think there's a correct answer to that either. I can't give a black and white. We're going to be personally impacted even if it's business because we're people. So, right? We're not robots. I think some people are more in tune with their emotional impact than others. So I think that that's more what it is, but we're human beings, not robots. Yeah. Anyways, guys, thank you. This was a very good, this is a hot topic. I feel like there could be so much more spoken about this, but I just wanted to, to give a little bit of a talk about this there. And then I gotta run for dinner. So, thank you all for being a part of the conversation. Hope it was impactful somewhere, and maybe someone needs to see that. I found it happened in collaboration with someone I partnered with. She refused to speak in person on the phone. Deborah, that's a perfect example of where we don't know how to be with feedback in conversation. Thank you. So that's a perfect example of that. Oh, thank you. Perfect example of someone who doesn't know how to be with feedback. We're not taught this stuff, right? Yeah. You're welcome. I don't always like having conversation either, but I kind of have to do it, right? So, because it's in service of something. But yeah, you don't know how to do with that. Purpose of the conversation. Okay, anyways. So long, everybody. Tony, thank you for the hug. I'm gonna go have dinner with my with the wonderful woman who's here to do a 3-day training with me with the horses. And thank you all for being present for this. And if you're watching the replay, feel free to make some comments, and we'll see you all on the flip side. On a side note, I'm going to post some videos today. If you've been following Apollo, really beautiful space this morning. I'm going to post videos and pictures of it because it was really awesome to kind of see. So he's doing very well. There's no stress anymore, so that's really great. Okay. You're welcome. Bye, everybody.